Nicholas Sheff was a standout student and was highly involved in his community. In less than a year, during his senior year of high school, he found himself waking up on the streets with nowhere to turn. For Nick, each day consisted of one purpose: finding the next opioid to get him high. Although Nicholas is only a fictional character in a movie, I've personally witnessed a close relative fall victim to opioid addiction. In the case of my relative, it was minor compared to the beautiful boy depiction of opioid dependency. However, I was still able to capture a glimpse of the negative consequences of opioid addiction and how easy it is for someone to become opioid dependent. I argue that the movie Beautiful Boy accurately represents the opioid epidemic and what is happening at large scale to people in our world today. More specifically, Beautiful Boy accurately represents how easy it is to become dependent on opioids, how opioids can ruin someone's life and their relationships with their loved ones, and how the opioid treatment process is complicated and can last up to several years, if not the rest of your life. So, let us look further into the film and analyze how Nicholas Sheff was first introduced to opioids. In the movie, Nicholas becomes addicted to opioids after stealing prescription medication from one of his friend's house. Before this, Nick had only experienced smoking weed, but he seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. Consequently, Nick wanted to find out what a high from prescription medication would feel like. It only took Nick one time to lead him on a spiral down opioid dependency. In the real world, people can become addicted to opioids very quickly, and sometimes it only takes a person one time to become dependent on the drug. In an article titled, How Long Does It Take to Become an Opioid Addict, published May 14, 2014, Sally Laws states, drugs as potent as opioids lead to addiction very quickly. If you misuse opioids or even take an opioid prescription for an extended time, your body will adjust to the drug and its effects. That's called building a tolerance to the drug. When this happens, more of the drug is required to accomplish the desired effect: a high, a buzz, or simply relief of pain. This quote captures what happens to Nicholas in the movie. He first started taking prescription painkillers for recreational purposes until he built a tolerance to them, and they no longer gave him the result he was looking for. It was after this that Nicholas began to experiment with stronger opioids like heroin. The movie depicts the time from Nick becoming addicted to prescription medication to Nick becoming addicted to heroin in about 5 months. But how relative to real life is a shift from prescription medication to heroin in 5 months? In my research, I found this to be possible. In the same article as I previously stated, Law says the length of time it takes to become dependent can vary from person to person. Dependence often depends on a number of factors, including previous opioid use, your overall health, your age, your body size, the strength of the drug, and more. Some people start opioid abuse in very high doses, which causes them to gain tolerance and become dependent quickly. For Nicholas, he had prior opioid use with prescription painkillers and started using opioids at very high doses. Ultimately, this led him to become severely addicted to different types of prescription medication and heroin very quickly. Later in the movie, David Sheff finds out his son is using heroin and does his research on opioid addiction. He learns that opioids are addictive because of the chemical connection it creates in your brain. When an addict is without the connection or chemical stimulus, their body has a severe reaction. They begin to feel extreme symptoms because their mind believes that something rewarding and essential is missing. In an article titled Opioid Addiction, published April 28, 2020, Heather Collins writes, opioid receptors are found in the nervous system, where they are embedded in the outer membrane of the nerve cells. When endogenous and exogenous opioids bind to the receptors, the interaction triggers a series of chemical changes within and between the neurons that lead to feelings of pleasure and pain relief. In the movie, during an emotional phone call with a friend who is a doctor, David Sheff learns of this exact process. The doctor explains to David that it is not merely Nick wanting to take the drugs at this point, but a chemical process that has taken over his brain and will not allow him to quit. Now, let's look at how accurate the film was in portraying how opioids affected Nicholas Sheff's personal life. In the film, opioids destroy Nicholas's social life, family life, work life, and many other aspects that were previously important to him. Throughout the film, Nick goes missing from his family and friends. 2 or 3 days would pass and nobody would hear from him. In a couple of days where he goes missing, we get to see that the only thing on Nick's mind is where he's going to find his next fix. He is not thinking about the concern of his family and friends, nor his health, and getting things like food and water. When I did my research, this type of behavior is common in those who become severely addicted to opioids. In an article titled, "How Long Does It Take to Become an Opioid Addict?" Laws writes, "The compulsion to obtain and use opioids becomes the top priority in their life. Other things that were once important, like work, relationships, or personal goals, fade into the background. Opioid addiction becomes inevitable the longer its use or abuse continues." This concept can be viewed in full effect in Beautiful Boy. There was nothing more important to Nick than scoring heroin or obtaining anything he could to get high. Nick's childhood dream of becoming a writer and his close relationship with his younger siblings and father were replaced with his addiction of heroin. One aspect of the movie that should be analyzed is the strain and toll of opioid addiction on Nicholas' father and family. I found this to be a very important concept from the movie and was portrayed accurately. Opioid addiction can destroy more than just the life of the user. In an article titled, "How Addiction Affects the Family," published April 29, 2020, Christina Murray writes, "Spouses, children, and parents who witness a family member struggling with addiction experience emotional damage, as well as financial, legal, medical, and other consequences. David Sheff tries everything he can do in an attempt to restore the relationship that he once had with his son. There are numerous scenes where David sits down crying, wondering if his son's addiction was all his fault. Also, Nick's younger brother and sister are continually asking David if they can call Nick because they do not understand why he is always missing from home." Another aspect that I came across in my research was the concept of family members of addicts lose all trust for them. In an article titled "Medication and Counseling Treatment," published April 22, 2017, Tom Codera writes, "Conflict becomes normal as family members fight to engage in a son or daughter who abuses heroin, for example. Trust begins to erode. Relatives may become more guarded if a relative is abusing illicit drugs, acts with aggression, or hides disorder and secrecy." In the movie, David begins to distrust his son's behavior after finding out he has been hiding his addiction from him. In one scene, Nick and David go to lunch after Nick had been missing for a couple of weeks. Nick begs his father to give him money so he can get something to eat. However, David understands that Nick wants the money for heroin and other drugs, so he does not give it to him. The disagreement leads them to yell and scream at each other until Nick finally leaves the cafe before they receive their food. Now, let us analyze how the movie depicted the treatment process and how accurately it displays actual treatment for opioid addiction. Throughout the film, Nicholas goes to rehab a total of 3 different times. Each time he begins to make progress, then relapses and falls back to where he started. I found this to be an accurate path that opioid addicts follow. In an article titled "Signs of an Opioid Relapse, published November 4th, 2019, it states, many people are faced with an uncontrollable urge to use opioids after they stop, especially in recovery. The trouble is that even people with years of sober time may slip up and use opioids. Due to the nature of addiction, certain triggers or old habits can make opioids a lifelong struggle. Like it is stated in the article, Nicholas struggles with an uncontrollable urge to use again after becoming sober from heroin for a couple of weeks. It is during an opioid addiction counseling meeting with fellow addicts that Nick meets an old girlfriend that he used to date in high school. She too had fallen into addiction, and it is through their relationship that she convinces Nick to shoot heroin for one last time. Of course, as a viewer, we know this is just the start of another binge of Nick using opiate drugs. One concept portrayed in the film that I found to be completely inaccurate was Nick's type of counseling for opioid addiction. Opioid addiction is an extremely severe type of habit, so it requires high-quality rehab. In an article titled Medication and Counseling Treatment, published April 22nd by Tom Kuderis, states, opioid treatment programs, also known as OTPs, provide MAT or MAT, the addition of medication for individuals diagnosed with an opioid use disorder. OTP also provides a range of services to reduce, eliminate, or prevent the use of illicit drugs, potential criminal activity, and/or the spread of infectious disease. OTPs focus on improving the quality of life for those receiving treatment. In the film, Nick was sent to counseling sessions with other addicts. There was no use of helpful medication or other services to help in preventing his addiction from getting worse. It depicts the treatment process as though Nick was supposed to do everything by himself. I found that in a real-world scenario, this is quite the opposite of the procedure that is applied. People with opioid addictions need help from the outside source because without so, they might never recover. So let me tie everything together. The movie Beautiful Boy accurately depicts how quickly you can become dependent on opioids, how opioids can ruin your life and the relationships with your loved one, and how the treatment is a long process that can be very ineffective for some people. Overall, it shows a complete analysis of the life of an opioid addict in the real world. Also, I would like to add that although I did my first speech over the statistical side of the opioid epidemic, Beautiful Boy opened my eyes to how devastating opioids can be on someone. It made me realize that the opioid epidemic is worse than I previously thought. And through the Jesuit tradition at Creighton has made me want to take more action towards helping those who are struggling with opioid addiction. It is embedded in our human dignity that we look out for each other and help those around you who need it. Thank you. And this is what my speaker notes looked like. Trying to find the first page. Thank you.